This weekend marks the 40th anniversary of the Dublin Monaghan bombings, which took place in May of 1974. 22 people were killed in what was the worst single atrocity of the Troubles in the Republic. And last week, Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore announced government funding for the victims. But why did the bombing happen? How did it happen? And why has it remained such a controversial episode to this day? Professor Diarmuid Ferriter, lecturer in modern Irish history at UCD, is going to explain. Diarmuid, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Now, first of all, we've seen in recent times pictures in black and white of what happened, the carnage. It was pretty awful.
It was horrendous. There were 3 bombs that went off at 5:30 in Dublin City Centre. One in Talbot Street, one in Parnell Street and one in South Leinster Street. Nothing like this had happened before. And the word that crops up most frequently in accounts of this is slaughterhouse. And that's what people faced. The horrific aftermath. The complete despair and confusion and people running in different directions, those who had managed to get away from the bombs. Bits of bodies, a young girl who was decapitated because she was so close to the bomb and could only be identified by her brown platform shoes. A lot of the victims, there were 34 victims, including an unborn but full-term baby. 34 victims. She could only be identified by those shoes. It'll give you an idea, I suppose, of the idea of blood running through the gutter. Robert Fisk, the journalist, described a newspaper photographer getting sick when he came across this, not just the blood running in the gutters, but the body parts. Vincent Brown, who at the time was working in independent newspapers on Middle Abbey Street, was in town with his brother Malachy, and he described in a very moving way going from bomb site to bomb site, and almost like slow motion, the sheer horror of it unfolding. And he recalled that himself and his brother attempted to pick up a victim and her body just disintegrated in their arms. So they were the kind of scenes that were experienced. And, you know,
and
people,
of course, the fear factor remained because you have 3 bombs in close succession to each other. And are there more?
That was the question, and what direction might they be coming in, you know, and could you possibly be, you know, running into danger? So complete carnage and confusion. And then there was the bomb in Monaghan that went off about an hour and a half later outside a pub. And that was devastating also. And, you know, when you look at the situation there was actually a bus strike on at the moment, but there were a lot of people in town, and a lot of the victims were young women, but the actual age range of the victims was from 5 months right up to 80 years of age. So you really got a full spectrum there.
Now, these weren't the first bombs in Dublin.
No, they weren't the first bombs in Dublin. And if you look at the broader context there in the early 1970s, and indeed the late 1960s, Loyalists had attempted attacks, some of them more successful than others, since the outbreak of the Troubles in 1969 across the border. And serious Dublin bombing occurred in December 1972. And this was 2 CIE workers were killed, 1 bus driver and 1 bus conductor. And this was at the time when the Offences Against the State Act was being discussed and was a very controversial issue politically. And at the time, Fianna Fáil wanted to amend that legislation to the effect that suspected subversives could be detained longer than they could be under the legislation as it existed. It was very controversial. It was regarded as a great attack on civil liberties, but was regarded by those in power as being essential. And whilst that was being debated, it seemed Liam Cosgrave, who was leader of the Fine Gael at the time, was in danger of losing the support of his own party.
And then the bombs went.
And then the bombs went off in the middle of these discussions. And at the time it was believed that the Fianna Fáil government at the time could be defeated and would then call a general election on a law and order ticket, which is a bit ironic given that Fine Gael historically and traditionally had presented itself as the law and order party. So Cosgrave was in a serious bind there. And the bombs went off at the very time that this was being debated in the Dáil, and of course it swung the vote in the other way.
And of course then there was the theory that this was done by people who were opposed to the Republican struggle in Northern Ireland, and therefore they orchestrated this thing to interfere with the politics.
Now, that might be seen as a bit far-fetched also. But you see, this is part of the difficulty of the early 1970s. There are so many different layers to what is going on. You know, there are the paramilitaries, there's British securities, the British government priorities, Irish political priorities. But in some respects, the 1972 bombs, even though the victim count was so much smaller, had actually more of a political impact.
Because of that law that was brought in. Now, what was the political background at the time of the 74 bombings? And we can talk about spooks and who might be behind all of this, but it was a very sophisticated operation to have done what they did so far from, their home base somewhere around Belfast.
And one thing that was really telling was that 100% of the bombs detonated, which would suggest a very highly sophisticated bomb-making exercise. And that raised questions, of course, about whether the UVF would have been capable of doing that on their own. But, in relation to the broader political context, it's vital. If you look at everything that had happened since 1972 in particular, when the Stormont Parliament in Northern Ireland had been abolished, unionists are feeling very much on the defensive. The B specials have also been abolished, and the idea that they are on the back foot. They're very, very concerned about the British government plans for Northern Ireland, because it seems in 1972 that the British government is struggling to come up with a coherent policy on Northern Ireland. But the broad parameters of what they want are apparent by 1973 and 1974. They want some form of power sharing assembly between unionists and nationalists. They want, obviously, there to be some form of cooperation between Northern Ireland and the government of the Republic, and then some form of British-Irish dimension. The question is, what form is that going to take? And in the atmosphere of the early 1970s, with all the violence that is going on, and with the political turmoil, how can they come up with a solution based on those different dimensions that the unionists will accept or swallow? And the unionists were hopelessly divided about that.
If you're looking to round up the usual suspects, clearly securocrats of some kind from the British side responsible, loyalists of some kind. Was there any ever suggestion that this was the potential work of some mad Republicans who would find this very interesting to polarise the Irish government in a particular way?
No, it may have been suggested over the years. It wasn't taken very seriously. It's fascinating to look at the contemporary reaction, because there's an awful lot of anger directed at the IRA, despite the fact that these were loyalist bombers and loyalist bombs.
It's your fault kind of thing.
Well, an awful lot of the coverage at the time, and it goes back to the broader political context, is that you're getting a taste of your own medicine, and that medicine has been administered by the Republican movement.
So in other words, you're bombing them, well, we'll bomb you, so therefore the fault goes back to the IRA for their
The fault goes back
atrocities.
to the IRA, and whatever about the emotions that have been generated by events like Bloody Sunday in 1972, the burning of the British Embassy in Dublin, people mobilising, by 1974 there has been such a body count that a lot of people in the Republic are getting very fed up with this. And, there is that sense that the IRA has to take responsibility for this. And a lot of contemporary journalists, for example, would have made the point that those who bombed Dublin in 1974 and Monaghan were of the same moral order as those who were responsible for, say, Bloody Friday in Belfast, when the IRA decided to carry out those attacks.
And now that we look at the Good Friday Agreement, who was it said, Sunningdale for slow learners, how different it might have been had that deal.
And the thing about Sunningdale is that the British and Irish governments are pressing ahead despite intense unionist opposition. Brian Faulkner, as leader of the Unionist Party, cannot keep the unionist family together. They are hopelessly divided on that. And it really is when the Ulster Loyalist strike and the Ulster Workers' Council begin to mobilise, bring Northern Ireland to a halt effectively, to stop this idea of them being trundled into a united Ireland through some Council of Ireland. One of the elements of the Sunningdale Agreement, even though it was parked, was the idea that down the line there would be further cooperation that ultimately would leave them very politically vulnerable. And of course you have a mixture of politicians and paramilitaries in relation to orchestrating the Ulster Workers' Council strike, which is going on. The Dublin Monaghan bombings actually occur a couple of days into the Ulster Loyalist Workers' strike. And then the other dimension to that is how the British Labour government reacts. What does the British Labour leader, Prime Minister Wilson, decide how he's going to react to this? He goes and makes a television address in which he states that those who are orchestrating this strike are spongers. They have been sponging off Westminster. They've been sponging off the British government. And that leads to absolute infuriation on the part of loyalists and unionists, and ultimately brings down the executive, brings down power sharing. And that's regarded then as a great victory for loyalists at that time.
The investigations into this bombing over the years, you have the immediate forensic investigation, which didn't appear to get very far. And then you've had inquiry on foot of demands by the families who were bereaved and so on. Have we any notion of truth in this?
Truth is extraordinarily difficult to establish for a whole variety of reasons. There was, by 1993, a lot of journalists interested in talking to paramilitaries and in talking to those in British intelligence who might be able to shed some light as to whether or not there was a wider collusion.
There was a UTV programme
The UTV programme,
Hidden
I think.
Hand.
Yeah, and Hidden Hand is essential in broadening the parameters of this debate and of this inquiry. And what they effectively do is highlight what they regard as very strong evidence that there was collusion between loyalist paramilitaries, in other words, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UDR and the RUC and British intelligence. And they talked to former British intelligence officers who asserted that there was collusion. And this raised the question then, was there going to be a political response to those revelations in 1993? That's one part of it. Yeah. The other part of it was how the families, who were so frustrated that they had not been given concrete information as to why the investigation never progressed adequately. There's two dimensions to the fallout from that. And ultimately, the political dimension leads to the creation of what becomes the Barron Inquiry.
Which takes how many years to report?
Well, it's established eventually in 1999 and it reports in 2003.
This is 10 years after the Hidden Hand UTV programme.
Now, what happened after the Hidden Hand as well is that the UVF came out with a statement and for the first time admitted responsibility, because they hadn't done in 1974, but they rubbished the idea that they had been assisted. They said that they had done it on their own. But, the Barron report is frustrated by lack of access to documentation. The British government doesn't cooperate with it. The British government does not hand over whatever documents it might have, and we're not aware of the full extent of the documents.
And the Taoiseach has now asked the British government to hand over.
This is the
documents.
Interesting way this is developed in the 10 years after the Barron report. But the Barron report was able to assert that it was quite clear that this was a UVF, UDR, RUC operation, that UVF from Belfast and Mid-Ulster had been involved in coordinating the different elements. What it said is that it was not fanciful or absurd to believe that there was British intelligence collusion, but that it did not have the evidence to be able to make that assertion. But what it also asserted was, and this was quite an arresting finding of the Barron report, was that the 1973 to 77 coalition government did not pursue this with the vigour that it should have, and it found that inexplicable. And that was something that was seized upon by those who were convinced that there has to have been a reason why the coalition government of 73 to 77.
And what is the surmise? Is it that they knew that at some level the British government had a responsibility, but it would not be politic at that time to make enemies of the British administration?
I think that is one part of it. I think there's another part of it as well, which is covered by the Barron inquiry to a point, which is, what were the Gardaí up to at that stage? What kind of information did they have? One detective inspector was quoted at one stage into, while these investigations were going on, as saying, we have the information, we know who did this, and we have enough information to put them away. So the question was, why wasn't that information acted on? And that was information that apparently came from British intelligence and was handed over to Army intelligence and to the Gardaí.
Are we talking about a 9/11 scenario where they had information in advance of these bombs, passed on to them by British intelligence, and they didn't act, and therefore their hands are not clean?
Yeah, no, that has been disputed both by the Barron inquiry and a subsequent inquiry, the McEntee inquiry, which was into why the Guards didn't pursue it the way they perhaps should have, and that was discounted, the idea that there was information available before this that wasn't acted on. But of course there were all these question marks, and there was also the missing information. The Barron inquiry, the McEntee inquiry, they can't get information for the Department of Justice. It seems to be that there are Gardaí reports, there are Department of Justice reports that are not available or else had gone missing. There are all sorts of gaping holes in relation to the paper trail. So it's very difficult either for Barron or the McEntee inquiry subsequently to come up with definitive conclusions.
Are we ever going to get answers? I mean, the families are talking about suing the British government, the burden of proof in a civil court much less than in a criminal court. But
what kind of evidence will they be able to use to bring a successful case? That's going to be one of the difficulties. I think the interesting thing about the experiences of the families over the last 20 years is that they really did feel forgotten. And I mean, that title of the group they have, Justice for the Forgotten, is well chosen. Margaret Irwin, who's the spokesperson for that group, has been very vocal over the years that, their reasons for wanting answers are not just to do with history, are not just to do with establishing the truth. It's also to give families information that they had been deprived of for so long. And the cruel irony of a lot of this is that some of those victims and relatives of the victims who were campaigning for the truth were actually regarded as, some of them, as being Provo fellow travellers, that they were under Garda surveillance, some of them, at some stages. I mean, the cruelest of ironies, because they were pushing this idea that there may have been British collusion, that they, in a way, were becoming suspect politically. That'll give you an idea of how difficult it is to carry this quest for justice, because sometimes you become embroiled in the contemporary political climate. And the contemporary political climate will always affect the way in which these issues are pursued. It's interesting at the moment that Eamon Gilmore is being, it seems, very forthright about the need for the British government to step up to the plate with regard to whatever information it has. That vigour certainly was not there in the late 1970s or indeed in the 1980s. So the political climate certainly does affect that. This is a new stage for the families of the victims, because they are also dealing with something that there's a very difficult issue around the burden of proof, and of course they're going to have to put themselves through very expensive and very tortured legal proceedings.
Wish them the best of luck in that regard. Dermot Ferreter, thank you very much for joining us in studio.